First contact with curiosity. The small spaceship hovered gently above the Earth, its sleek, metallic surface gleaming under the sunlight. The humans standing below looked up in amazement as the vessel slowly descended. It was the first time they had encountered this particular alien species, the Zilara. Unlike other species humans had met, the Zilara were peaceful and curious by nature, always eager to learn about new cultures and ways of life. As the ship landed, its doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and a group of Zilara stepped out. They were tall and graceful, with smooth blue-tinted skin and bright, curious eyes. Leading them was Lilia, a young Zelaran woman whose fascination with humans had driven her to be part of the delegation. Her eyes scanned the surroundings with excitement as she stepped forward. "Welcome to Earth," Sarah, one of the human scientists, greeted them with a warm smile. "We've been eager to meet you." Lilia returned the smile, though hers was more out of curiosity than warmth. "Thank you, Sarah," she replied, her voice soft and melodic. "We have heard much about humans, and I am eager to learn more about your species." The two groups exchanged greetings, and soon enough, they were seated in a makeshift meeting room, sharing knowledge about their cultures and biology. The atmosphere was friendly, filled with curiosity on both sides. As the conversation flowed, Lilia leaned in, her large, reflective eyes fixed on Sarah. "I have heard that humans reproduce differently from us," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Can you tell me more about it?" Sarah blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected the topic to come up so quickly, but she nodded, doing her best to stay professional. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully, "human reproduction is a complex process. It's not just physical, it's also emotional. When two people care for each other, they form a bond, and sometimes that leads to creating new life." Lilia tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "A bond," she repeated. "What kind of bond?" "It's hard to explain," Sarah admitted, feeling a bit awkward. "Humans don't just reproduce for survival. There's a connection between two people, something that goes beyond biology. It's about emotions, love, affection, trust." The alien's eyes widened. "Love," she echoed. "That is not something we understand. The Zilara reproduce asexually, through cloning. There is no bond, no emotion involved. It's simply a way to ensure the continuation of our species." The humans in the room exchanged glances. The contrast between their species was becoming clear. For the Zilara, reproduction was just a practical matter, efficient and emotionless. For humans, it was deeply personal. Lilia's curiosity only deepened. "But why would you add emotions to such a process?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Wouldn't that make it more complicated?" Sarah chuckled softly. "Yes, it does. It's very complicated, but it's also what makes us human. It's what makes life meaningful." Lilia leaned back in her chair, thinking over what Sarah had said. Her mind buzzed with new information, and she was fascinated by how different humans were from her own people. "I want to know more," she said finally, her voice full of wonder. "How exactly does it work?" The room went silent for a moment. The humans weren't sure how much detail they should go into. After all, it wasn't exactly a topic they discussed with strangers, especially not alien strangers. But Lilia's innocent curiosity was hard to resist. "We could explain it scientifically," Sarah suggested, sensing the discomfort of her colleagues. "It involves two genders, male and female, and the joining of their genetic material to create a new life. There are cells involved, eggs and sperm, and a process where these cells combine to form an embryo, which grows into a baby." Lilia listened intently, her mind absorbing every word. "And this process, it happens when two humans feel this bond you mentioned?" she asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's not something that just happens randomly. It usually happens between two people who care about each other deeply." Lilia's eyes sparkled with fascination. "That is remarkable," she said slowly. I've never heard of reproduction involving emotions before. It seems so intimate. It is, Sarah agreed. For humans, it's not just about survival. It's about creating life together and forming a family. The young alien sat quietly for a moment, processing everything she had learned. It must be very special, she said finally, her voice filled with awe. To feel such a connection, and then to create life from it. Sarah smiled, appreciating Lilia's genuine interest. It is special, she said softly. Lilia nodded slowly, her mind racing with questions. I would like to experience this bond, she said, surprising the humans once again. It sounds wonderful. The room fell silent once more. The humans exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond to such a request. Lilia's desire to experience human reproduction was innocent, but it was clear that she didn't fully understand the depth of what she was asking. Lilia, Sarah began carefully, it's not something you can just try. It's complicated. It's about more than just the process. It involves feelings, relationships, trust. It's not something that happens easily or quickly. Lilia tilted her head again, her expression thoughtful. I see, she said softly. Perhaps there is more to learn about humans than I first thought. And with that, the first seeds of understanding were planted, between two very different species, both curious and both eager to learn. Curiosity deepens. Lilia couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Sarah. The concept of human reproduction, with its intricate mix of biology and emotion, was unlike anything she had ever encountered. In her world, everything was logical, practical. Reproduction in the Zelleran culture was purely a matter of ensuring the species' survival, done in sterile labs, devoid of any personal connection. But humans made it sound different, meaningful. The next day, Lilia found herself walking through the human base, her mind full of questions. As she wandered the corridors, she saw humans interacting with each other, laughing, talking, and even hugging. Such physical expressions of affection were rare in Zelleran culture, and they fascinated her. She observed a young couple sitting close together, their hands intertwined, as they whispered and smiled at one another. Lilia approached Sarah later that afternoon, her curiosity only growing. Sarah, may I ask you more about what we discussed yesterday? She inquired politely. Sarah smiled warmly, sensing Lilia's eagerness to learn. Of course, Lilia. What would you like to know? I've been observing your people. Lilia began, her large eyes filled with genuine curiosity. They seem to share these bonds you spoke of, not just for reproduction, but in everyday interactions. There is a closeness between them that I do not understand. Do all humans feel this way toward each other? Sarah chuckled softly. Not always, no. But many of us form close connections, friendships, family bonds, romantic relationships. It's part of what makes us human. We're social creatures, and these bonds are important to us. Lilia furrowed her brow. So these bonds are not just for reproduction, but for other reasons as well. For comfort, companionship. Exactly, Sarah replied. Humans need each other. These connections help us feel safe, supported, and loved. It's more than just survival. It's about thriving emotionally as well. Lilia was quiet for a moment, processing this new information. The idea of emotional dependence was foreign to her. The Zellara were fiercely independent, and their relationships were based on intellectual compatibility, not emotional connection. But the more she learned about humans, the more she began to wonder if her own species was missing out on something important. Your people seem very close, Lilia said thoughtfully. It must be comforting to have someone to rely on like that. Sarah smiled gently. It is, but it can also be complicated. Relationships take work, and sometimes they're not easy. But in the end, most people feel it's worth it. Lilia tilted her head slightly, her curiosity deepening. In Zelleran society, we are taught to rely on ourselves. We value knowledge and self-sufficiency above all else. But your people seem to thrive on this connection. Perhaps we have much to learn from each other. Sarah nodded. I think so. Every species has something unique to offer. It's what makes the universe so interesting. Lilia's mind buzzed with thoughts. She wondered what it would be like to form a bond like the humans did. The idea of sharing one's emotions, of trusting someone so deeply, was foreign but intriguing. Her scientific curiosity was merging with a personal desire to understand something she had never experienced. As the evening grew darker, Lilia wandered outside the base, looking up at the stars. The vastness of the universe spread out before her, but for the first time in her life, it didn't feel as lonely. There was something about humanity, something she hadn't expected to find in her quest for knowledge. It wasn't just their reproduction that fascinated her now. It was their ability to connect, to form bonds that gave life meaning. Suddenly, Lilia felt a sense of longing. She had never felt this way before, and it unsettled her. Could it be possible that she, too, could experience such a connection? Could Azelaran, with all her logic and rationality, feel something as powerful as love? Lilia's heart raced at the thought. For the first time, her curiosity wasn't just scientific, it was personal. As Lilia's understanding of human relationships grew, so did her internal conflict. She wanted to learn more, to experience the depth of human connection for herself. But how could she, an alien from a species that viewed emotions as irrelevant, possibly understand something so deeply human? Her journey had only just begun, and Lilia knew that the answers she sought would challenge everything she had ever known about herself and her species. Crossing boundaries, Lilia's curiosity only grew stronger in the days that followed. She couldn't stop thinking about the differences between her kind and humans, their emotional bonds, their closeness, and most of all, their way of reproducing. It fascinated and confused her at the same time. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing out on something profound, something that gave the human experience an extra layer of meaning. Her scientific mind was buzzing with questions, and she knew that to truly understand, she would need to go beyond just observation. But how could she approach the subject without offending anyone? Human customs were still new to her, and she feared crossing some invisible line. One evening, after another long day of observing the humans around her, Lilia decided to speak to Sarah again. The two had grown close since their first conversation, and Sarah had become something of a cultural guide for her. If anyone could help her navigate this sensitive topic, it was Sarah. Sarah, Lilia said, her voice hesitant as they sat together in the base's quiet common area. I've been thinking a lot about what we discussed, about human bonds and reproduction. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. I figured you might have more questions, she said kindly. It's a pretty big topic. Lilia nodded. Yes, it is. And I feel like I still don't fully understand. You see, in Zelaran culture, reproduction is strictly a biological function, done in sterile environments. There is no personal involvement. But with humans, it seems much more intimate, connected to emotions and bonds. I'm curious about how that affects the experience. Sarah chuckled softly. You're right, it's definitely not just a biological thing for us. There's a lot of emotion and trust involved. It's about being vulnerable with someone, sharing something deeply personal. Lilia's antennae twitched slightly in thought. Vulnerability was not something her species valued. In fact, it was often seen as a weakness. But here, humans seemed to embrace it as part of their nature. It was a perspective she struggled to understand. After a pause, Lilia asked the question that had been gnawing at her for days. Could I experience it? Could I try to understand what it's like for humans? Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by the boldness of Lilia's question. There was a moment of silence as Sarah processed what her alien friend was asking. Are you asking if you want to experience human reproduction? She asked cautiously, trying to gauge the seriousness of Lilia's inquiry. Lilia's gaze was steady, her curiosity genuine. Yes, I want to understand it, not just as a scientific observation, but as something more. I've seen how important it is to your people, how much meaning it carries. If I am to truly learn, I need to experience it firsthand. Sarah let out a small laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. You really are a scientist through and through, aren't you? She said with a grin. But Lilia, that's not something you can just jump into for research purposes. It's a deeply personal and emotional experience for most people. It's not something to be taken lightly. Lilia frowned, her frustration growing. I understand that. But how can I ever truly grasp human nature if I don't experience the things that define it? If I'm going to learn about your species, I need to fully immerse myself. Sarah placed a comforting hand on Lilia's shoulder. I get it. You're curious, and you want to understand. But this is one of those things where observation and experience are not always the best methods. Sometimes understanding comes from empathy, from listening and learning from others' experiences. Lilia looked down, her mind racing. She had never encountered a challenge like this before, where logic and science couldn't give her all the answers. For the first time, she realized that there might be limits to what she could understand about humans, at least in the way she had always approached knowledge. Maybe you're right, Lilia said finally, her voice soft. Maybe this isn't something I can understand through experience alone. But it's hard for me to accept that. My entire life has been about learning through doing. Sarah smiled. That's what makes you a great scientist, Lilia. But sometimes the most important things in life aren't just about the facts. They're about what's in here. She tapped her chest lightly, indicating her heart. Lilia's antennae twitched again, but this time it wasn't from confusion. It was from something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. For the first time, she realized that maybe human emotions, the very thing she had found so perplexing, might be the key to truly understanding their nature. As the two sat in silence, Lilia reflected on her journey so far. She had come to Earth seeking answers, but instead, she had found more questions. Yet, despite the uncertainty, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection with the humans around her. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to learn from them than she had ever imagined. Alien curiosity, human boundaries. As the days passed, Lilia's curiosity about human relationships and reproduction deepened. Despite Sarah's gentle guidance, the Zelleran alien couldn't shake her desire to explore these unfamiliar concepts more thoroughly. Lilia had always believed that the key to true understanding lay in first-hand experience, and in this case, that belief was pushing her to learn in ways humans might consider unorthodox. One evening, while observing the human settlement from a distance, Lilia decided to speak with someone who might offer a more scientific perspective on the matter. Dr. Martin, a well-respected human biologist stationed at the same research base, had been studying both human and extraterrestrial biology for years. If anyone could bridge the gap between Lilia's scientific curiosity and human emotional complexity, it would be him. Approaching Dr. Martin in the lab, Lilia greeted him with her usual formal tone, though she felt a slight nervousness she couldn't quite explain. Dr. Martin, may I ask you a few questions about human biology? The doctor looked up from his work, smiling at Lilia with a welcoming expression. Of course, Lilia. What's on your mind? Lilia hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I've been observing human interactions, particularly those related to emotional bonds and reproduction. I find it perplexing. I was hoping you could help me understand why it is so important to your species. Dr. Martin leaned back in his chair, his interest piqued. Ah, I see. It's certainly a complex topic. Reproduction for humans is not just a biological function. It's deeply intertwined with emotions, relationships, and social structures. It's about connection, trust, and often love. Lilia's antennae twitched slightly, as they always did when something puzzled her. But why? From a purely logical perspective, reproduction can be achieved without such emotional attachments. In Zelleran culture, it is a sterile process, conducted for survival and continuity. There are no emotional bonds involved. Dr. Martin nodded, acknowledging the difference between their species. I understand that. But for humans, emotions are a core part of our existence. They influence how we form bonds, how we cooperate, and even how we evolve as a society. Reproduction, for us, is often a shared experience that strengthens those bonds. Lilia paused, processing his explanation. So, it is about more than just survival for your species. It is about creating deeper connections. Exactly, Dr. Martin replied. For many humans, the act of reproduction is part of a larger emotional journey. It's about family, legacy, and trust. It's also about vulnerability, being open to another person in a way that can be both beautiful and terrifying. Lilia's eyes widened slightly, trying to grasp the concept. Vulnerability is seen as a weakness in Zelleran culture. Why would humans embrace such a thing? Dr. Martin chuckled softly. In many ways, vulnerability is strength. It allows people to grow closer, to trust one another on a deeper level. It's risky, sure, but it's also incredibly rewarding when shared with the right person. Lilia sat quietly, absorbing his words. This was something entirely outside of her experience, a concept so foreign that it almost felt unsettling. Yet she couldn't deny the fascination she felt. Humans, with their complex emotional lives, were unlike any species she had encountered before, and perhaps that was part of why they had survived and thrived in the galaxy, despite the odds. After a moment, Lilia finally spoke again. I want to understand this more, but how can I learn about such deep emotions without experiencing them myself? Dr. Martin smiled gently. That's a tough one, Lilia. Emotions like love and trust can't be learned from a book or a lecture. They come from living, from being part of the human experience. But that doesn't mean you have to rush into it. Give it time, and focus on building relationships with the people around you. Understanding will come naturally. Lilia nodded, though her scientific instincts still yearned for direct experimentation. She understood now that some aspects of human life could not be dissected or analyzed like a data sample. They had to be felt, experienced, and lived. As she left Dr. Martin's lab, Lilia pondered the idea of vulnerability. It was something she had never valued before, but now, as she continued her journey among the humans, she wondered if it was the key to unlocking the mysteries she sought to understand. Maybe, just maybe, the answer lay not in her quest for knowledge, but in her willingness to open herself up to these strange, emotional beings she was growing fond of crossing the line. Lilia's fascination with human reproduction had only deepened after her conversation with Dr. Martin. The idea of emotional bonds intertwined with such a basic biological function was unlike anything she had encountered before. She spent her nights pondering how a species could evolve with such vulnerabilities, and yet thrive in a universe that was often cold and unforgiving. One day, as she sat in the observation chamber overlooking the human colony, she noticed a couple, Sarah and her partner James, laughing and enjoying each other's company. They were carefree, their body language expressing a closeness that went beyond words. Lilia had observed them before, but now, with her newfound understanding, she saw more than just companionship. She saw trust, warmth, and the emotional connection that Dr. Martin had described. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in Lilia, a feeling she couldn't quite identify. Curiosity, mixed with a strange longing to understand more, pushed her into action. She needed answers, and she needed them directly. Her scientific mind wouldn't let her sit idly by any longer. Later that evening, when Sarah was alone, Lilia approached her, her alien grace making her movements smooth and deliberate. Sarah, she began, her tone respectful but filled with determination. There is something I need to ask you. It's about what we discussed before, regarding human reproduction and emotions. Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Lilia's intensity. Sure, what's on your mind? Lilia hesitated for a brief moment, then spoke with a directness that was typical of her species. I want to experience it. I want to understand the emotional and physical connection that humans share during reproduction. Can I try it? Sarah's expression froze for a moment, taken aback by the bluntness of the request. She quickly recovered, but a flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Lilia, that's not something you can just try. Human reproduction is deeply personal, and it's tied to feelings, relationships, and a level of trust that takes time to build. Lilia tilted her head, her antennae twitching slightly. But I've observed many humans forming bonds quickly. Some even engage in this act without long-term emotional commitments. If it is such an important experience, should I not attempt to understand it firsthand? Sarah let out a small, nervous laugh. Well, yes, some humans might not approach it with the same seriousness. But for many, it's a very intimate thing. It's not just about the physical act. It's about the connection between two people, a connection that takes time to develop. Lilia stepped closer, her voice steady. I understand the importance of emotional bonds, but my people have always learned through direct experience. This is how we evolve, how we grow. If I do not experience this aspect of humanity, how can I truly understand your species? Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of Lilia's words. She realized that Lilia wasn't asking out of mere curiosity. It was a deeper need to connect, to understand humans on a fundamental level. But the line Lilia was asking to cross wasn't a simple one. Lilia, Sarah said softly, I get that you want to understand. But this isn't just a scientific experiment. Emotions aren't something you can turn on and off. Once you open that door, things change, sometimes in ways you don't expect. Lilia considered her words carefully. She had always prided herself on her logic and reason, but in this moment, she felt something new, an uncertainty that made her pause. Then how can I learn if I cannot experience it directly? Sarah smiled, her voice gentle but firm. You learn by building relationships, by being patient, and by understanding that some things take time. You don't need to rush into this. There are other ways to connect with people that don't involve reproduction. Lilia nodded slowly, her usual confidence shaken just a little. Perhaps you are right. I must be patient. As she walked away, Lilia realized that this was one lesson about humanity that would not come easily. Understanding their emotional depth would require more than just observation or experimentation. It would require time, trust, and perhaps, for the first time in her life, vulnerability. In that moment, Lilia understood that her journey to understand humans was far from over, and that maybe the real challenge wasn't learning about them, but learning about herself in the process. A new understanding. The days following Lilia's conversation with Sarah were filled with deep reflection. For the first time, Lilia realized that understanding humans required more than scientific curiosity. It required empathy, patience, and a willingness to step outside her comfort zone. She had always believed that knowledge came through direct experience, but Sarah had shown her that some things couldn't be rushed or forced. Lilia spent more time observing the human colony, but now her observations were different. She wasn't just watching their behavior. She was paying attention to the subtle emotional cues that humans shared with one another. A smile, a touch on the shoulder, a knowing glance, all of these small gestures carried weight, and they told a story far deeper than any physical action alone. One afternoon, Lilia found herself in the common area of the research facility, where a group of humans were gathered, laughing and chatting about their day. She noticed how they communicated without words, how their shared experiences created an invisible bond that tied them together. There was no need for grand declarations or complicated rituals. Human connection was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. Dr. Martin entered the room, noticing Lilia standing quietly in the corner. He walked over, a warm smile on his face. How are you doing, Lilia? You seem deep in thought. Lilia turned to him, her antennae twitching slightly as she considered her words. I have been reflecting on what Sarah said. Humans are more complex than I initially thought. Your emotional bonds, the way you connect with one another, it's not something that can be understood through observation alone. Dr. Martin nodded, pleased to see Lilia's growth. That's true. Human relationships are messy, unpredictable, and often illogical. But that's what makes them so powerful. They're built on trust, shared experiences, and sometimes even vulnerability. Lilia's eyes flickered with curiosity. But why do humans allow themselves to be vulnerable? Wouldn't it be more efficient to avoid emotional pain, to protect yourselves from harm? Dr. Martin smiled, understanding the alien's confusion. You're right, it would be more efficient. But humans are willing to take that risk because the rewards of connection, love, and companionship are worth the potential pain. It's part of what makes us who we are. Lilia considered his words carefully. In her species, efficiency and survival were paramount. Emotions were seen as distractions, unnecessary complications. But humans were different. They thrived on the very things her people had avoided for millennia. Perhaps there is more to your species than I realized, Lilia admitted, her voice thoughtful. You value something intangible, something that cannot be measured or quantified. Dr. Martin chuckled. Exactly. Emotions are messy, unpredictable, and sometimes even irrational, but they're what give life meaning. Without them, we're just going through the motions. Lilia looked around the room once more, watching the humans interact with one another. She could see it now, the invisible threads of connection that bound them together. It wasn't just about reproduction or survival. It was about something deeper, something that her people had yet to fully grasp. I think I understand now, Lilia said quietly. To truly know your species, I must not only observe but also feel, to experience the world as you do, with all its complexities and contradictions. Dr. Martin smiled warmly. You're on the right path, Lilia. Understanding humanity isn't easy, but it's a journey worth taking. As Lilia left the common area, she felt a newfound sense of purpose. She had always been driven by logic and reason, but now she understood that there was more to life than cold calculations. Humans had shown her a different way of being, one that valued connection, emotion, and the beauty of imperfection. And for the first time in her life, Lilia was ready to embrace the unknown, to step into the world of human emotions, and see where it would lead her. Bridging worlds. Lilia stood on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars. Earth rotated slowly below her, a blue and green jewel suspended in the vastness of space. She had always admired its beauty from afar, but now it felt different. It wasn't just a planet. It was a home, a place filled with people who had shown her the depths of their hearts and the complexities of their minds. The door behind her slid open with a soft hiss. Sarah walked in, joining Lilia at the window. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stared out into the expanse, sharing a quiet companionship that had formed in the aftermath of their earlier conversations. You've changed, Lilia, Sarah said finally, her voice gentle but knowing. Lilia glanced at her, her antennae twitching slightly. I believe I have. Your people have taught me things I never expected to learn. Sarah smiled softly. I'm glad. You were always curious, but now it seems like you're understanding us on a whole new level. Lilia nodded. I have come to realize that humans are far more than just physical beings. You are driven by emotions, connections, and bonds that transcend mere logic. It's something my people have struggled to comprehend. Sarah laughed lightly. Yeah, we're a bit of a mess, but we like it that way. Lilia's eyes twinkled with amusement. I can see that now. It's not about efficiency or perfection. It's about living fully, embracing the chaos and beauty of existence. Sarah leaned against the window, her eyes drifting to the stars. So what's next for you, Lilia? You've learned a lot, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Lilia considered the question carefully. Her mission had been to observe and report back to her homeworld, to gather data on humanity's biology and behavior. But now, that seemed too narrow a goal. She wanted to understand more, about humans, about emotions, about the connections that tied people together. I will continue to learn, Lilia said after a moment. but not just as an observer. I want to participate, to experience your world as you do, to form bonds, to take risks, to feel. Sarah smiled warmly. That's the best way to understand us. It won't always be easy, but it'll be worth it. As they stood together, watching the earth turn beneath them, Lilia felt a strange sense of peace. She had started this journey with questions, seeking answers that could be quantified and studied. But now she knew that some things could not be measured. They could only be lived. Her homeworld would never fully understand humanity unless they embraced the same journey she was embarking on. It wasn't just about collecting data or studying behavior. It was about opening oneself to the experience of life in all its messy, beautiful glory. And for the first time, Lilia was ready to do just that. As Sarah patted her on the shoulder and left the observation deck, Lilia remained, her thoughts drifting into the vast unknown. She had bridged a gap between two worlds, and while the path ahead was uncertain, she knew it was one worth following. For humanity had shown her that life was not just about survival, it was about living fully, with all the love, fear, hope, and wonder that came with it. And Lilia, for the first time, felt truly alive.